Salt. It's something we eat almost every single day, and most of the time, we don't even think about it. We just reach for it, sprinkle it over food, and move on, as if it's the most obvious thing in the world. But the moment you stop and ask a simple question, what salt actually is, why we need it, and whether all salt is really the same, the whole topic suddenly becomes much more interesting. Because salt is strange. It looks simple. It feels ordinary. It sits quietly on the table and never asks for attention. And yet it has changed cooking, trade, preservation, health, industry, and even history itself. Entire cities grew because of salt. Wars were influenced by salt. Trade routes were built around salt. People have valued it for thousands of years, and today most of us treat it like background decoration. So in this video, we're going to slow down for a minute and look at salt properly. What it is, how it works, why your body needs it, why food without it feels flat, what different types of salt actually are, and whether expensive salt really deserves its reputation. And by the end, salt will probably stop looking like just salt. Let's start with the core idea, because chemically, salt is much simpler than the way people often talk about it. Common edible salt is sodium chloride, NaCl. That means it is made of two elements, sodium and chlorine. On their own, these elements are not exactly friendly. Sodium is highly reactive, and chlorine is a toxic gas. But once they bond together, they form a stable crystal that becomes one of the most important substances in daily life. And that's part of what makes salt so interesting. It's a perfect example of how chemistry can completely change the behavior of matter. Two dangerous things combine, and suddenly you get something essential for food, for biology, and for survival. Your body needs sodium. Not in absurd amounts, of course, but it does need it. Sodium helps regulate fluid balance, supports nerve signals, helps muscles contract, and plays a major role in maintaining normal bodily function. Without enough sodium, the body doesn't work properly. That doesn't mean more is better. It just means salt is not some random seasoning. It has a real biological purpose. When you look at salt crystals closely, they form a cube-like structure. That's why many salts break into angular, geometric pieces. It's not artistic, it's chemistry. Even something as ordinary as table salt is quietly following very precise physical rules. So before we even talk about taste, or gourmet salts, or pink crystals in expensive jars, it helps to understand one thing. Salt is not just a flavor. It is a mineral, a chemical structure, and a functional part of both food and life. Now here's the part most people notice without really understanding. Salt changes food dramatically. And interestingly, it doesn't do that just by making food taste salty. In many cases, its real power is that it makes other flavors easier to notice. Salt can reduce bitterness. It can balance sweetness. It can sharpen savory notes. It can make ingredients feel more complete, more connected, more alive. That's why food without enough salt often tastes flat, dull, or strangely unfinished. It's not always because the recipe is bad. Sometimes the structure is there, the ingredients are there, the cooking is fine, but the flavor never fully opens up. In a way, salt acts like a translator. It helps your tongue understand what the food is trying to say. A tomato tastes more like a tomato. A potato tastes fuller. Meat becomes deeper. Even desserts sometimes become better with a little salt, because it balances sweetness and makes the flavor less one-dimensional. And this is why professional kitchens care so much about seasoning. Not because chefs are obsessed with making things salty, but because they know that food without proper seasoning is incomplete. Salt is often the difference between "this is edible" and "this actually tastes good." There's also a texture side to it. Salt can draw moisture out, help create crusts, affect preservation, and change the way ingredients behave during cooking. So when people think of salt as a simple finishing touch, that's only part of the story. Salt is involved much earlier and much deeper than that. So yes, salt is simple, but simple things can still do a lot of work. Let's start with the most familiar kind, table salt. This is the one sitting in ordinary kitchens all over the world, and because it is so common, people usually assume it is the least interesting. But even table salt has a story. Table salt is highly refined sodium chloride. Usually, it is mined from underground salt deposits, then processed to remove most impurities and trace minerals. What you get in the end is a very consistent, very fine, very predictable product. It dissolves quickly, measures easily, and behaves the same way almost every time. Its chemical formula is still the same, NaCl. But what makes table salt different is refinement. In many countries, table salt is iodized, meaning iodine is added to help prevent iodine deficiency. That matters because iodine supports thyroid function, and in some populations, iodized salt has played an important public health role. Anti-caking agents are also often added, because manufacturers want the salt to pour freely instead of turning into a damp, stubborn little brick in the shaker. That's not glamorous, but it is practical. Historically, refined salt became more common as industrial processing improved. And that's the key word here, practical. Table salt is not romantic, not artisanal, not dramatic. It's efficient. It works in everyday cooking, in baking, in soups, sauces, eggs, pasta water, almost anything. If there's a weakness, it's that it can feel a little one-dimensional compared to more textured salts, especially when used as a finishing salt. But for basic kitchen work, it's reliable, cheap, consistent, and functional. Not exciting, maybe, but not everything in a kitchen has to perform like it's auditioning for a documentary. Sea salt sounds more natural, and in a way it is. It is produced by evaporating seawater, usually in shallow pools where the water disappears and the salt remains behind. That means the source is different from mined table salt, even though the main chemical substance is still sodium chloride. This is where a lot of people start imagining major health differences, but the reality is less dramatic. Sea salt does contain small amounts of other minerals such as magnesium, calcium, and potassium, but nutritionally, these amounts are usually tiny. They are not meaningless, but they are often exaggerated in marketing. Where sea salt really becomes interesting is texture and character. Depending on how it is harvested and processed, sea salt can be fine, coarse, slightly damp, flaky, or crisp. That affects how it lands on food, how fast it dissolves, and how you perceive it in a bite. In other words, sea salt is often more about experience than nutrition. Historically, sea salt has been produced for thousands of years, especially in coastal regions where evaporation was practical. It was one of the oldest ways humans collected salt, long before modern refining plants turned everything into a uniform white powder. Sea salt is especially good as a finishing salt. On roasted vegetables, grilled fish, tomatoes, bread with butter, or even chocolate desserts, it can add little bursts of texture and flavor that refined table salt doesn't deliver in the same way. It feels more alive on the surface of food. So, sea salt is not magic. It will not transform your life. But it can change the way food feels in your mouth, and sometimes that matters more than grand claims on fancy packaging. Now we get to the celebrity of the salt world, Himalayan pink salt. It's visually striking, instantly recognizable, and somehow always manages to look expensive, even before anyone says a single word about minerals, wellness, or purity. Himalayan pink salt is mined from ancient salt deposits in the Punjab region of Pakistan, near the Himalayan foothills. Technically, it does not come from the snowy mountain peaks people imagine when they hear the word Himalayan, which is already a useful correction. The pink color comes from trace minerals, especially iron, and that's what gives the crystals their warm orange-pink appearance. Chemically, however, it is still mostly sodium chloride. That is the important part. The mineral content exists, yes, but the core of the product is still the same basic salt structure. So while Himalayan pink salt looks special and may contain dozens of trace minerals in tiny amounts, it is not a nutritional revolution. Its real strengths are visual appeal, texture, and the emotional effect it has on people. It looks premium, it feels substantial, it makes simple food look more intentional. And in food, perception matters. People absolutely taste with their eyes first. This kind of salt is often used for finishing, for presentation, for salt grinders, and for foods where appearance plays a role. It can look beautiful on grilled meat, roasted vegetables, dark chocolate, or even just on the edge of a plate if someone is being very dramatic. So is it better? Not necessarily in a life-changing way. Is it different? Yes. Is it more beautiful? Also yes. And sometimes, if we're being honest, beauty is part of why people enjoy food in the first place. Kosher salt is one of the most practical salts in cooking, and chefs love it for a reason that has very little to do with hype and a lot to do with control. The crystals are larger, flatter, and less dense than standard table salt, which makes it easier to grab with your fingers and distribute evenly over food. That matters more than it sounds. When seasoning by hand, texture gives feedback. You can feel how much you're using, which means you're less likely to overdo it. With fine table salt, things can get intense very quickly. With kosher salt, the process feels more physical and more controlled. The name comes from its traditional use in koshering meat, where salt was used to draw blood out of the surface. So the name is historical and practical, not chemical. The formula is still sodium chloride. The difference is shape, grain size, and usability. Kosher salt is excellent for seasoning meat, vegetables, pasta water, and pretty much any savory cooking where you want control during the cooking process rather than a fancy finishing effect. It dissolves well, but not as instantly as table salt, and that makes it feel calmer in the hand and in the kitchen. Its history is less glamorous than pink salt and less poetic than sea salt, but in terms of actual cooking usefulness, kosher salt is one of the smartest tools you can have. It doesn't try to impress anyone, it just does its job very well. And honestly, that may be the most respectable kind of ingredient there is. Black salt is where salt stops feeling ordinary and starts feeling a little strange, which is part of why it's so memorable. The moment you smell it, you understand that this is not going to behave like normal salt. Because black salt, especially the variety known as kala namak, used in South Asian cuisine, contains sulfur compounds that give it a very distinct egg-like aroma. Yes, egg-like, which means that the first time you encounter it, the reaction is usually either curiosity or confusion, sometimes both. Its chemistry is still based around salt, but the sulfur compounds make the flavor profile very different from plain sodium chloride. This is why black salt is so popular in vegan cooking. If you want something to taste more like egg without using egg, black salt can do a surprisingly convincing job. Historically, kala namak has been used in India and surrounding regions for a long time, especially in chats, spice mixes, fruit dishes, and savory snacks. It is not just a gimmick. It has a real culinary role. It works best in dishes where you actually want that sulfur note. Vegan egg salads, tofu scrambles, chickpea fillings, fruit with spice, or traditional South Asian preparations. But this is not the kind of salt you sprinkle on everything just because you feel adventurous. Used badly, it can make food smell like a very confused breakfast. So black salt is unusual, strong, and useful in very specific contexts. Not subtle, not universal, but absolutely interesting. Smoked salt is one of the easiest ways to add a layer of complexity to food without actually changing the cooking method. It is usually sea salt or another coarse salt that has been exposed to smoke from burning wood, often over a controlled period of time, until the crystals absorb a deep, smoky aroma. The chemistry here is less about a new formula and more about infused volatile compounds from smoke attaching themselves to the salt. In practical terms, that means the salt carries the aroma of wood fire into the dish. And this makes smoked salt incredibly useful because it can create the impression of grilling, barbecue, or open fire cooking even when you're working in a much simpler environment. It's like adding a memory of fire to the food. Smoked salt works especially well with meat, roasted potatoes, grilled vegetables, mushrooms, eggs, and even some cocktails or chocolate desserts if you want a savory contrast. It is not subtle, and that is the point. It brings atmosphere. Historically, smoke and salt have always had a relationship because both were used in food preservation. Smoked salt feels modern and artisanal, but in spirit, it belongs to a very old culinary logic: preserve, intensify, and deepen flavor. Used well, it can make food feel richer and more layered. Used badly, it can make dinner taste like somebody stored the potatoes inside a fireplace. So, like many good things, restraint helps. Blue Persian salt is one of the rarest salts you can find, and honestly, it looks like something that shouldn't even exist in a kitchen. It comes from ancient salt deposits in Iran, formed millions of years ago, and that blue color is completely natural. It's not added, it's not artificial. It happens because of tiny structural changes inside the crystal, something known as light refraction in the mineral lattice. In simple terms, the salt bends light in a slightly unusual way, and that's why you see that blue shimmer. Chemically, it's still sodium chloride, NaCl, just like any other salt. So nutritionally, it doesn't suddenly become something magical. It still provides sodium, supports fluid balance, nerve function, and muscle activity, just like regular salt. But what makes it different is the experience. The texture is slightly harder, more crystalline, and the taste is interesting. It starts sharper than normal salt, almost a quick burst of saltiness, and then it fades faster than you expect. It doesn't linger as long, which makes it feel cleaner. This kind of salt is usually used as a finishing salt, especially in high-end restaurants or for presentation dishes, where the visual effect actually matters. You might see it on seafood, premium cuts of meat, or even desserts where contrast is important. And let's be honest, sometimes it's not just about taste. Sometimes you're just trying to impress someone, and blue salt definitely helps with that. Because normal salt says, "This tastes good," but blue salt says, "I made an effort." Now let's talk about fast food, because this is where salt stops being a quiet seasoning and becomes a strategic tool. Fast food companies understand salt extremely well, not in a poetic way, but in a behavioral way. Salt makes food taste stronger, faster, and more immediately satisfying. A single fast food meal can contain a surprisingly high amount of salt, often somewhere around 1.5 to 2.5 grams, and sometimes even more, depending on the combination of fries, burger, sauces, nuggets, and sides. That is a lot for one sitting, especially considering how easy it is to consume without thinking. Why so much? Because salt intensifies flavor, improves palatability, and works especially well with fat and sugar. Together, these create foods that are easy to crave and hard to ignore. That isn't accidental. It's product design. Fries are a perfect example. Without salt, they feel dull almost immediately. With salt, they become much more vivid, much more rewarding, much harder to stop eating. The same goes for burgers, sauces, and processed snacks. Salt is part of the system that keeps the flavor hitting quickly and consistently. This does not mean salt is evil. It means food companies know exactly what it does. And once you understand that, fast food starts looking less mysterious. Not better, not worse, just more engineered. And honestly, engineered flavor is still flavor. It's just helpful to know when the experience is natural and when it has been carefully built to make you want one more bite. So what is salt, really? It's a mineral. Sodium chloride, NaCl. Simple, but powerful. Different salts may look different, feel different, and be used in different ways, but at their core, they're all built on the same idea. Table salt, simple and reliable. Sea salt, more natural, better for finishing. Himalayan salt, about texture and appearance. Kosher salt, control and precision in cooking. Black salt, strong, unusual, and very specific. Smoked salt, depth and aroma without fire. Blue salt, rare, visual, and made to stand out. Now, here's something important. Salt is essential for your body. It supports hydration, nerve signals, and muscle function. But too much salt can increase blood pressure, put stress on your heart, and lead to long-term health problems. So, like many things, it's not about removing it, it's about balance. And maybe that's the most interesting part. Salt is everywhere, and yet most people never really think about it. So now I'm curious, which salt would you choose?